welcome to the interview today with Sean Wheelock from Bellator MMA. I'm Steve Jewin from MMA Mania. Sean, thank you so much for joining us.
Steve, it's great to be back with you. Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure. We've chatted a few times before on my Glove Up or Shut Up podcast, but now we're having you here because we've got Bellator 131 coming up this weekend at the Valley View Casino Center in San Diego, California. And of course, you worked with Art Davie on the book, Is This Legal? And we're going to get into that as well. But first of all, with only a week to go before the big event takes place, I want to get your thoughts on this new era of Bellator we're stepping into. It's a dawning of a new age where instead of doing the tournaments, instead of doing weekly shows, we're going to start having monthly shows and cards that are pretty loaded up. So what are your thoughts as we move into the Scott Coker era?
You know, this feels like the first real Scott Coker show. You know, a lot of people have been saying, oh, you're Bellator 2.0. I think we've been Bellator 1.5 since Bjorn Rebney moved on, and Coker came in, you know, because it's still Bjorn Rebney's venues, some of his fighters. We had to finish tournaments, and to Scott Coker's credit, he honored all the tournaments. He could have just pulled the plug on that, but he honored the fighter contracts, the tournaments, the venue contracts. This feels like our first real show. I mean, we've seen signs of it. I think Bobby Lashley and Carl Etherington a couple of weeks ago in Wichita, that's probably not a fight Bjorn Rebney makes. He certainly wouldn't make Rick Hahn versus Dave Jansen. He wouldn't have made Melvin Methoff versus Doug Marshall. So we're seeing those Scott Coker fights. But now the show on November 15th, I am incredibly psyched up for it. This is a real Scott Coker show. And look, I'll be totally candid with you. You know, Bjorn Rebney was great to me. He brought me over from M1 when I was not that well known as an MMA commentator. I was at Pride at the very end, but a lot of people, at least in North America, stopped watching Pride by then. So many people didn't really know that I was the final Pride commentator. It was like I'd been the Pride commentator in the earlier mid-2000s. I didn't arrive until 2006. So I'd missed that really golden period of Pride. I was at M1, and we definitely had our niche following on M1, but not a lot of people watched it. We were on HDNet, Access TV, but HDNet at the time. And I know some of the hardcores watched, but I wasn't that well known. And Bjorn Rebney brought me over along with Jimmy Smith, which was the best possible thing that could have happened because Jimmy and I had already worked together for a few years and had our rhythm and our chemistry and our deep friendship. And put me on, and I was his guy, and I was always his guy. And he started with me as his guy, and he left with me as his guy. And full credit to him. You know, I know a lot of things have come out from fighters and from other people, managers, saying different things about Bjorn Rebney. And I'm not here to defend him. I'm not here to attack him. I'll just tell you honestly. He treated me extremely well, took really good care of me. But Scott Coker brings a different attitude, and my experiences with Scott Coker have been amazing. And I really think Bellator needs to be shaken up. You know, it's almost like if you look like a pro sports team. Sometimes the head coach gets fired, not because he did a bad job, but because things got a little stale. And if there was one thing with Bellator, I think we probably got a little stale. So, you know, I loved Strikeforce. There was not a Strikeforce show that I missed on Showtime or Showtime Extreme. I had set my DVR on a lot of nights. If I was on the road doing Bellator, I would come home, and once I saw my wife and my kids, I would settle in and I would watch my DVR of Strikeforce. I thought their shows were great. They had fights that people wanted to see. They always had a big feel. I never once watched a Strikeforce that felt small. People watch those, and there's a big energy to those fights. Right. It's not a bad thing, in my opinion, to have stars who became stars in another organization. I mean, that's just the world. You just can't develop everybody. It's not 1993 anymore.
Right, and that's what I was going to say about Bjorn is, in fairness to him, the cyclical nature of MMA is that people become stars over time by going to different places. You don't see, very rarely do you see one fighter who has spent their entire career in one organization fighting for one promoter.
Yeah, and you know, in the era when Pride was very dominant and at their best, you know, you saw Josh Barnett leave the UFC and go to Pride. Chuck Liddell, Rampage Jackson would move, and he moved back and forth. Heath Herring then came over to the UFC after Pride went away. Wanderlei Silva was in the UFC, Pride and back, and there was that movement. And fair enough to fighters, you know, they want to make as much money as they can because, like all professional athletes, they have a very small window which they can perform. But you know, I think I'm of the opinion that competition is healthy in MMA. You know, I'm glad that the UFC does well. I hope TV ratings for everything do extremely well in MMA. You know, I don't think that we're each other's competition. I don't think Bellator's competition is the UFC or the World Series of Fighting. I think our competition is the 30 million Americans who watch the NFL every week. Let's get some of those people in rather than worrying about cannibalizing the few million people that watch the show.
It does need to be mentioned that this is a triple header Saturday we've got coming up on November 15th. Why all three promotions ended up on the same day, I'll never know. But Bellator is at least putting the best foot forward by saying, here's all these fighters you know and remember and recognize, and we're giving them to you for free on Spike TV.
You know, I think it's great to have those options for MMA fans. Watch everything, you know. Set your DVRs. You know, the technology that we have, right? It's not the 1980s where you have to make a choice or you have to pull out your Sony Betamax.
That's
true. Go wall to wall. Maybe like the old, before college football went completely off the rails, the old days when Steve, you and I were kids and you would put on New Year's Day and there were like 6 or 8 bowl games. You could just watch bowl games all day long. Do that with MMA. You know, it is weird in World Series of Fighting jumping into the fray, but fair enough. You know, let it be a day for MMA fans to absolutely love, and they can time shift around and they can watch. There's this great thing in television now called DVR+3, which means that advertisers will count people who've watched their DVR within 3 days of the live broadcast. So hey, fair enough. I hope people watch us live, but I just hope that people watch us.
I'm sure they will, especially with the amount of trash talking Tito Ortiz and Stephen Bonnar have done leading up to this fight. In fact, I did a transcription of one of Tito's interviews, and it was almost unprintable, the things that he said.
Yeah, and remember, you're talking to the person who, along with Jimmy Smith, commentated Affliction 2 with Tito Ortiz.
Yeah, so you know very well. You've got experience with the kind of trash he can talk.
Yeah, you know, Tito Ortiz, he's such a great character, and what was really staggering, and I don't use that word lightly, staggering to me, back in May, in our pay-per-view just outside of Memphis, you know, Rampage Jackson's from Memphis. The main event is Rampage Jackson and King Mo Lawal, and there's the feud, and there's all this heat. Essentially, you know, we're in Rampage's hometown, 20 miles from where he grew up, and yet the biggest ovation of the night, entering and exiting the cage, was for Tito Ortiz. You know, he's that love to hate him athlete. You know, every single sport has that type of athlete. You either love him or you hate him, but you can't ignore him, and that's Tito Ortiz. And people say, oh, he's not relevant anymore. Well, no, he is still relevant because people still respond. Tito Ortiz is only not relevant when people don't care anymore. And people very, very much care what happens with Tito Ortiz. He's clearly not the Tito Ortiz of 10 years ago, but so what? He's an excellent fighter. He put it on Shlemenko, and now he has a really intriguing, entertaining fight coming up with Stephen Bonnar. You know, and as a hardcore fight fan, Steve, and I know you are as well, not every fight has to be number 1 and number 2 in the world.
I always think of the line from Private Parts, the Howard Stern movie, where they surveyed people and the response they got was, well, half of our respondents said that they tuned in because they liked him and they couldn't wait to hear what he was going to say next. And then what did the other half say? Well, the other half said they couldn't stand him, but they were tuned in because they couldn't wait to hear what he was going to say next. So,
Exactly. And I'm a huge Stern fan, by the way, and I'm friends with a couple of staff writers who I've had out to Bellator. And right, Howard Stern is that love him or hate him type of character, but everybody knows who Howard Stern is. You know, is anybody in the public figure, whether you're an entertainer or whether you're a professional athlete, you at least want to have name recognition. And that's what you get with Tito Ortiz. You get that tremendous name recognition. And I can only imagine what the crowd reaction is going to be like when he enters the cage next week in San Diego. A lot of people are going to be standing and cheering, and a lot of people are going to be standing and booing, but no one's just going to be sitting there.
And the American Psycho is part of one of the biggest drawing live MMA audiences ever on Spike. So you've already got one home run with Tito Ortiz. He's a trash talker. He's a big audience draw. And you got Stephen Bonnar, who's been in one of the most famous fights in MMA history. And it's just going to be fireworks. The crowd is going to be so amped up to see the two of them trade.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and we've been talking about Pride, and one of the things that I loved about Pride is that they had legitimate world-class fighters, right? They had Crow Cop when he was at his best, Fedor Emelianenko when I think he was the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world. They had Wanderlei Silva when he was at his best, and Rampage Jackson came in, right? Just the amazing amount of stars. But then they also found places for Professor Henry Miller and Bob Sapp, and Giant Silva and Eric Butterbean Ash and Zula Zinho. You know, it was fun. Not every fight has to be so incredibly serious. You still had your legitimate fights, and then you still had your crazy fun fights. And that's one thing I think Scott Coker is bringing that Bjorn Rebney just philosophically didn't want to do. Let's have those really fun fights. You can have a lot of serious title contention, meaningful fights, and you can just have some fun fights. And at least the way I read it, the way I feel personally as a hardcore fan of MMA, that's what we need to see in this sport. We need to have that balance of both.
Yeah, I think this card offers that mix because the co-main event is Will Brooks and Michael Chandler, and it's going to determine the real lightweight champion because Eddie Alvarez, you know, he left for UFC and he's no longer with Bellator, so the title's vacant now. Whoever ends up holding that interim title at the end of the night becomes the true lightweight champion. You know,
a lot of people weren't watching us then because it was our first season on MTV2. It was spring 2011, but Michael Chandler against the then 17-year-old Marcin Held fought in the opening round of the Bellator lightweight tournament. Chandler was very, very new into the sport and Held literally just a kid. You know, if he were American, he would have been a senior in high school, which is insane. And he got Chandler in a knee bar. And Chandler fought it off and then put Held in a head and arm choke and got a technical submission, choked him unconscious. But Held, even at that age, showed that a Chandler, Division I wrestler, scrambling in a very, very deep knee bar. You know, Held has gotten a lot better. He's gotten older. He's gotten bigger, more mature. He's moved from a brown belt to a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So Eddie Alvarez, obviously it's difficult when you see someone of that talent walk. You know, the UFC would hate to see Eddie Alvarez walk. You know, he is a big star. But Brooks is the real deal. Chandler's definitely proven himself to be the real deal. And then lurking right there, you have Held and you have Jansen. It's pretty stacked at 55 for Bellator.
Oh yeah, and Jansen, he had the perfect line himself when he said, I'm 7-0 at Bellator, show me a guy with a better record than that. So if he's not fighting for a title soon, I could see him having a number one contenders match. You know, maybe take the tournament winner Held and pair the two of them off and see what happens.
You know what, I like the way that you're thinking, and again, that's the new philosophy. You know, if we'd had this conversation a year ago with Bjorn Rebney, you wouldn't even bring that up because that's not going to happen. At best, those two would be on opposite sides of the bracket in an 8-man 55 tournament. But there are no more of those machinations where, wow, I hope this guy beats him and maybe he'll beat him and then he can beat him and he'll beat him. Because we know that that's not the way our sport works, you know? If you want to predetermine matchups, then you should go to pro wrestling. You should do works instead of shoots. And
right.
I can tell you on and on, time and time again, throughout my 5.5-year history with Bellator, where somebody was brought in, they were supposed to win this tournament, win this fight, to fight this guy, and 100% of the time it did not work. It absolutely did not work. Starting with when I came in season 2, when in the semifinal round of the lightweight tournament, Pat Curran upsets Roger Huerta. Bjorn Rebney had thrown a ton of money at Roger Huerta. He wasn't long off being on the cover of Sports Illustrated and the UFC Golden Boy. And here's Pat Curran, who was basically a circuit fighter in the Midwest, and he beats Huerta. And I think that was a welcome to MMA for Bjorn Rebney. You know, you can hope that this guy beats this guy and this guy beats this guy, but it's only going to get you so far. If you hope, you have to just make the fights that people want to see. Don't go through all of these torturous machinations of, wow, if he beats him and then he beats him. That's what Scott Coker sees. Let's just give the people fights that they want to see. Let's not go through, as my English wife would say, this whole rigmarole of how you get there. Just skip all of that and make the fight.